One war, one bond, one final breath. No one thought he'd make it through the night, but Max did. The old German shepherd stood still in the darkened room, eyes fixed on the man who had once carried him through fire and fear, and then he moved. Not out of instinct, but out of something deeper, something no one could explain. They said the veteran had minutes to live, but what his dog did next? It wasn't in any medical textbook. It was in the space between loyalty and miracle, between the last breath and the first spark of life. Do you believe in miracles? If so, type something below. Even a single word of faith might just be enough. The winter wind moved like an old ghost through the narrow streets of Asheville, North Carolina. It was late January, and the Blue Ridge Mountains loomed in the distance like sleeping giants under a dull gray sky. Frost clung to the power lines, and the sidewalks bore the crunch of salted snow. The town, known for its music, art, and charming historic homes, felt quieter than usual. Cafes opened late, stores were shuttered early. Even the street musicians had disappeared, driven indoors by the chill. At the edge of town, down a gravel road flanked by brittle oaks and frostbitten grass, stood a small, weathered house. The paint had once been pale green, now faded to the color of old lichen. A wraparound porch sagged slightly on one side, and a rusted wind chime clinked lazily in the cold air. Inside, the house was warm, but only barely. The wood stove in the living room coughed out heat in spurts, and the scent of burnt pine lingered in the air. John Miller sat in his recliner near the fire, wrapped in an old army blanket. At 68, his frame had narrowed with age, but traces of strength still clung to his shoulders and hands. He had the bearing of someone used to command, a straight spine, sharp gaze, and the kind of stillness that made people hesitate before speaking. His skin, weathered and sun-beaten, bore the evidence of years spent outdoors, in harsh terrain. His silver beard was trimmed short but uneven, and deep lines etched his face, especially at the corners of his mouth and above his brows, as if every memory had carved its name there. John had served 24 years in the U.S. Army, most of them in infantry, and the final 10 as a combat trainer. He'd been stationed in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. 3 deployments had left him with shrapnel scars on his legs, tinnitus in his right ear, and a silent, invisible wound lodged somewhere between his lungs and his heart. His wife, Ellie, had passed 5 years ago, a sudden stroke that took her before he could get back from Kuwait. Since then, his daughter Rachel had drifted further away, both in geography and affection. At his feet lay Max. Max was a 6-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat and a quiet, watchful nature, larger than average and powerfully built. His ears stayed alert even when he appeared to be resting. A faint white streak marked his chest like a faded badge. Max had been John's K9 partner during his final tour in Mosul. The dog had saved lives, found bombs, sniffed out ambushes, and once shielded John from a grenade's blast by sheer instinct. He bore a shallow scar along his right flank, now mostly hidden by fur, and a slight limp that came and went with the cold. They had both returned from the battlefield with the same mission: survive quietly. The VA doctor had delivered the news a month ago. John's heart had an aortic aneurysm, a ticking time bomb that could rupture at any moment. Surgery was possible, but risky. Medication could only delay the inevitable. John had thanked the doctor, shaken his hand, and walked out with no plans to return. He'd decided then and there, no hospitals, no tubes, no beeping machines. Just him, Max, and the mountains. That morning, John had fed Max early and taken him for a short walk near the stream that bordered the property. They didn't go far. His breathing had worsened over the past week, and climbing the small slope behind the house now left him dizzy and winded. Still, Max didn't stray. The dog moved with the same military discipline John had drilled into him years ago, always pacing half a step behind or beside, his amber eyes flicking toward his handler with silent intuition. John poured himself a cup of black coffee. Trembling slightly as he sat back down, he stared at the faded family photo above the mantel. Ellie stood beside him in a sundress, laughing as Rachel, only 8 at the time, clung to his leg in a swimming pool. That day had been easy. That kind of day hadn't come around since Rachel. She hadn't been home since Thanksgiving 2 years ago, now 35. Rachel was a trauma nurse in Raleigh. Her hair had always been a soft chestnut brown, usually tied back in a bun that showed off her high cheekbones and almond eyes. Her mother's features, not his. Strong-willed, fiercely independent, and brilliant in every way that made John proud but unsure how to reach her. They had grown apart the day Ellie died. Rachel had needed comfort, but John, halfway across the world, then stuck in a transport lockdown, hadn't arrived in time to hold her or even bury his wife by the time he did. Rachel had already packed up, closed the house, and made her peace without him. He'd written letters, emails, left voicemails on birthdays. Sometimes she responded. Often, she didn't. But he kept the phone line open anyway. As John sipped his coffee, Max suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked. A low, throaty growl vibrated in his chest. "What is it, buddy?" John muttered, reaching instinctively for the old revolver in the drawer, but there was no need. The growl softened. Max stood up, padded to the door, and sat like a statue. A second later, the screen door creaked. John opened it slowly. Outside, standing in the snow with a suitcase in one hand and a thermal coffee cup in the other, was Rachel. She was taller than he remembered, or maybe he'd just grown smaller. Her parka was zipped to her chin, and a faded green beanie covered her hair. She didn't speak, not right away. Max's tail wagged gently. Recognizing her after a pause, her eyes were tired, not from the trip, but from life. "I didn't want to wait until it was too late," she said. John stepped aside. "Come in, then." Max led the way, like he always did. The cold had deepened overnight. By morning, the branches of the oaks that lined John's property sagged under the weight of wet ice, and the snow had hardened into a thick crust that cracked like broken porcelain beneath any step. Asheville, under winter's command, looked like a frozen painting, still, silent, waiting for something to stir. John Miller sat wrapped in his wool coat on the back porch, a faded paperback resting on his lap. He wasn't reading it. His breath came in shallow waves, visible in the frigid air. He hadn't been sleeping well. The dull ache beneath his ribs had been growing more frequent, and he had begun experiencing short spells of lightheadedness. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind him that the clock was ticking. Max, lying by the steps, lifted his head suddenly. The dog's ears pricked, and his body stiffened. Then, without warning, he stood and bounded into the backyard, his paws punching through the crusted snow. He ran to the base of the oldest tree on the property, an enormous white oak whose roots coiled like veins above the ground, and began to dig. John watched, puzzled. "Max," he called, his voice raspier than usual. "What are you after, boy?" The dog ignored him. Max's front paws tore through snow and soil, sending clumps flying. His tail stood still, rigid. His nose twitched in rhythm with each paw stroke, as if something beneath the ground demanded his full attention. But there was no rabbit, no squirrel, no fresh scent trail, just the old earth, the spot he chose. Notably, was the same patch of ground where John often sat in the summer, his favorite reading place, shaded by the oak's generous canopy. John pulled himself to his feet and trudged across the yard. His knees complained, and his chest burned faintly with each breath. He knelt beside Max and reached out, placing a hand gently on the dog's back. "What is it, huh? You smell something?" Max paused, glanced at him, then resumed digging. Slower this time, more methodical. His nails scraped against something solid. Wood, maybe? John bent forward and squinted into the shallow hole. It was just a piece of old root, bleached and brittle. He exhaled. "Just a tree." "Buddy," he muttered. But Max remained tense, ears swiveling toward the tree's trunk, then toward the forest beyond. He growled low, not angry, alert. John stood and scanned the woods. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute. That evening, after a dinner of reheated stew and half a slice of cornbread, John took Max inside and settled into his recliner. He flicked on the radio, old country music humming softly through static. Max lay down nearby, eyes on the front door. Unusually focused, It happened around 10:30 p.m. John had just turned off the lamp and begun drifting to sleep when a sharp pain shot through his chest. It wasn't the usual ache. This was deeper, like a fist tightening around his heart. He gasped. Dropping the blanket and clutching his chest, Max was up in an instant, barking sharply, circling John like a trained medic. John tried to rise but collapsed onto the floor, knocking over the side table. His fingers scrabbled for his phone, but missed. Max barked again, louder this time. Then, without hesitation, the dog bolted for the front door. The screen door had a latch, one Max had figured out years ago. With one determined leap, the dog pawed it open and tore across the snowy yard toward the neighbor's house, a modest ranch-style home belonging to a man named Dean Porter. Dean, a retired postman in his early 70s, was tall and lanky, with skin like worn leather and a long, bristly mustache. He'd known John for nearly 20 years, mostly in the quiet nod-and-wave sort of way neighbors interact in rural towns. Dean had always admired Max. "That dog's smarter than most people," he'd once joked. That night, Dean had just sat down with a hot toddy and a weather report when he heard the furious barking outside his front door. He opened it to find Max pacing and snarling, running a few steps toward John's house, then doubling back. Something about the dog's eyes, wide, glassy, urgent, sent a chill down Dean's spine. All right," he muttered, pulling on his boots. He grabbed his coat and flashlight and followed Max into the dark. By the time they reached the porch, John was unconscious, curled against the wood stove. His face had gone pale, lips tinged blue. Dean dropped to his knees and shouted his name, shaking him gently before rushing to call 911. Max stood watch, growling softly at the silence, as if daring death to cross the threshold. John woke up in the hospital the next morning. The room smelled of antiseptic and plastic, and the ceiling tiles blurred in and out of focus. Machines beeped in rhythm to his heartbeat, and a dull IV sting burned in his arm. A nurse with short blonde curls and a kind, lined face stood at his bedside, adjusting the monitors. "You're lucky, Mr. Miller," she said. "Mild heart attack. If your dog hadn't gotten someone in time..." John blinked slowly, trying to sit up. "Max?" "He's fine. One of the EMTs brought him. He's in the hallway with a blanket." John nodded, swallowing hard. His eyes welled before he even realized it. "Good boy," he whispered. Across the state in Raleigh. Rachel Miller sat on the edge of her bed in a small studio apartment, scrolling through her phone. She wore navy blue scrubs and had just come off a 14-hour shift. Her back ached, and her eyes were raw from fluorescent lights. She hadn't spoken to her father in days. The last time she'd visited, it hadn't gone well. Her voice had risen. His had gone silent. They'd sat at the dinner table like two statues, separated by 1,000 miles of silence. Her phone buzzed, a voicemail from Dean. She hesitated before hitting play. "Hey, Rachel, this is Dean Porter, your dad's neighbor. Don't mean to alarm you, but John had a heart incident last night. He's okay, at the hospital now. Just thought you should know. That dog of his, Max, he saved his life. No question about it." Rachel stared at the screen. A dozen emotions flooded her at once: guilt, anger, worry, confusion. But above all, there was the old wound, the scar she still carried from the night her mother died, and her father didn't show. He'd been somewhere over the ocean, unreachable. And when he did arrive, he stood at the funeral like a stranger, too formal, too composed, as if duty still clung to him like a uniform. She closed her eyes. She didn't call back. Snow fell steadily in Asheville, each flake descending like a silent prayer. The roads were slick with black ice, and the rooftops sagged under inches of packed white weight. The air smelled of smoke and cedar, and even the birds had gone quiet. Winter had fully wrapped the town in its cold embrace, and for those who lived alone, or felt alone, the days grew longer, heavier, quieter. Inside room 312 of St. Joseph's Hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. John Miller lay propped in a hospital bed by two flattened pillows, a nasal cannula feeding oxygen into his lungs. His complexion was sallow, and the deep-set lines around his eyes had turned darker. his hands, once capable of field-stripping a rifle in 30 seconds flat, now trembled slightly when reaching for the plastic water cup on his tray. He'd been there 3 days since the incident. His vitals had stabilized, but his heart had weakened further. The cardiologist, a compact man named Dr. Amir Qureshi, had visited earlier in the morning. Dr. Qureshi was in his mid-40s, with soft brown eyes and precise movements. His beard was trimmed neatly along his jaw, and his voice was calm but never dismissive. Born in Chicago to Pakistani parents, he had grown up watching his own father battle heart disease. That memory had made him attentive, meticulous, a man who measured risk with respect. "I'll be blunt, Mr. Miller, Doctor," Qureshi had said gently. "Next time, you may not be this lucky. The aortic wall is thinning. Surgery is still an option, but the longer you wait—" "I'm not doing it," John interrupted, his voice hoarse but firm. "Told you that already." "Doctor," Qureshi studied him quietly. "You're a soldier, yes?" "Was," John said. "Then I assume you understand the concept of a ticking clock. I also understand a man's right to choose how he meets his end." They had parted on polite but heavy terms. Now, in the dim silence of the room, John reached down slowly and ran his fingers through the fur of Max, who lay curled beside the hospital bed on a folded army blanket. The hospital staff had made an exception for him, after hearing what the dog had done. Max had barely left John's side since their arrival. The dog's large head rested near John's knee, and every few minutes his ears twitched in tune with some inner alertness. Max's breathing was deep, steady, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm so measured it felt deliberate. It had a calming effect. John found himself breathing with him, unconsciously matching the pattern. In the middle of the night, when the ward was quiet and nurses floated like ghosts, that sound, Max's breath, was the only anchor John had against the darkness crawling through his body. On the second night, just past 2 a.m., John awoke with a sharp gasp. Pain stabbed beneath his ribcage, and his chest felt as if it were collapsing inward. His hand shot to his side. The room spun, his vision tunneled. A sound escaped his throat, half cough, half plea, but no one was around. Max stood in an instant. The dog climbed partially onto the bed, one paw bracing against the mattress, the other gently resting near John's waist. His nose pressed against John's chest, not frantic, not barking, just pressure. Gentle, firm, rhythmic. He leaned in, his body heat warm against John's failing lungs. The dog's breath came in deep waves, calm, determined, as if he were breathing not for himself, but for his human. John's lungs tightened, and then slowly began to loosen. The pain began to fade, not disappear, but back off, like a tide pulling away from shore. He could breathe again, shallow but real, his eyes filled with water, and he reached for Max's neck, fingers curling in thick fur. "You're not supposed to know how to do that," he whispered, voice barely a thread. Max lay back down, tail thumping once, then stilled. 2 rooms away, in a small nurse station tucked between hallways, an older night nurse named Gladys Carter looked up from her clipboard. She was a wide-hipped woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair in a tight bun and reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. A widow of 15 years. She had worked the night shift so long that the darkness no longer troubled her. She glanced at the monitor screen, noted John Miller's irregular spikes, and was halfway out of her chair when she saw the lines stabilize again. She muttered, "Tough old bastard," and went back to her notes. Miles away in Raleigh. Rachel sat at her small dining table, a half-drunk glass of wine next to a closed laptop. She wore a plain white sweatshirt, her hair tied up in a messy bun. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of distant city traffic muffled by snow and double-paned windows. The letter had arrived in the mail 2 days prior. She hadn't opened it at first. It was written in his unmistakable handwriting, tight, left slanted, no wasted loops. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, as if it had waited a long time. That night, after finishing her shift, she lit a candle and finally tore it open. The paper inside was creased and smelled faintly of tobacco. It began plainly, like him, "Rachel, if you're reading this, I either didn't have the guts to say it in person, or I'm no longer around to try." She had to stop halfway through. Her breath caught as she read the next paragraph. He talked about the night her mother died, how helpless he'd felt in a desert across the globe, how he'd begged a commanding officer for a satellite call that never came, how guilt had shaped every word he failed to say afterward. He wrote of his own father, drunk, brutal, unforgiving, and how he'd sworn he'd never be that kind of man, but didn't know how to be any other kind. He wrote of Max, how the dog had been the first soul he had truly trusted since war broke his faith in people. "I know I failed you, Rachel, but you were never a failure to me. Not for 1 second. I just didn't know how to love with anything other than silence. Maybe Max taught me too late." Her hands trembled. She folded the letter and sat there for a long time, candlelight flickering against her face. Then she picked up her phone and began searching for a rental car. The snow had melted in patches, leaving behind streaks of brown slush along the sidewalks of Asheville. February's sun crept timidly through a thin veil of clouds, casting the town in a pale light that made everything look quieter than it was. The air still held a chill, but the sharp edge of winter had dulled. It was a transition kind of day, the kind of day where endings and beginnings blurred into the same breath. John Miller stood at the edge of Maple Street with Max sitting calmly at his heel. He wore a dark wool coat buttoned to the neck, a knit cap pulled down over his ears, and thick leather gloves that made his hands look bulkier than they were. His cane tapped lightly with every other step. He was thinner now, his cheeks sunken, the whites of his eyes veined red from interrupted sleep, but there was clarity in his gaze. And when he walked, he still carried himself like a man who had once marched under heavy sun with 20 men following behind. Max, as always, moved like a shadow beside him, obedient, steady, alert. His fur was darker with age, the tan parts dulled into a honey brown, and a faint gray had begun to creep into his snout. His limp had returned with the cold, but he walked without complaint, ears flicking back occasionally to check on his partner. They crossed the street slowly, cars pausing without honking, drivers nodding respectfully before moving on. People knew John, maybe not personally, but in a town like this, stories stuck around longer than names. Most knew he was a veteran, a widower, the man with the war dog who never left his side. Their first stop was the bakery. Benny's bread and biscuit had been open since before John moved to town. The doorbell jingled as he stepped inside. The smell of yeast and sugar warmed the air like a blanket. Behind the counter stood Lucille Bennett, a woman in her late 50s with deep smile lines and a plump figure that made her apron seem 2 sizes too small. Her auburn hair, always pinned back in a messy twist, was streaked with flour. She looked up and beamed. "Well, if it isn't my favorite soldier and his handsome boy," she chirped. "It's been too long." "John," he nodded, removing his cap, "wanted to make one more round." "Lucy." Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before softening. "Still like those cinnamon rolls with the pecans?" John smiled faintly. "Max will take one too." She packed 2 warm rolls into a paper bag and passed it over, then came around the counter to crouch in front of Max. "You keep him safe now," she whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. Max thumped his tail once. Their next stop was the park. It was a modest green space, lined with wooden benches and a frozen fountain in the middle. Parents usually brought their kids here in the warmer months. Today it was empty, save for a young woman jogging in earbuds and a man feeding pigeons in a threadbare coat. John and Max sat on the third bench from the east gate, beneath a maple tree that would one day bloom again. John pulled the roll from the bag, tore off half, and laid it in front of Max. The dog sniffed it, then rested his chin on the bench's edge. "Remember the time we found that girl behind the fence?" John asked softly, though there was no one to answer. "Barely spoke a word. You found her before any of us. Just walked up, sat down beside her like you knew." He watched a pigeon hop through the frost toward them. Max didn't move. "You always knew who needed you most," he said, rubbing the dog's ear. Their final stop was the police station. Officer Dean Morales stepped out as John approached. Dean was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with skin the color of cinnamon and eyes that always looked halfway amused. He had once been a Marine before joining the local force. Tall and easygoing, He often volunteered with the K-9 units and had worked with Max during training sessions after John retired. "Well, I'll be damned," Dean grinned. "Didn't expect to see you out and about." John nodded. "Making my rounds?" Dean's smile faded into something more solemn. He stepped forward and offered his hand. "You need anything?" "John, anything at all, you call me." "I will," John replied. "Take care of the town." Dean looked down at Max and gave a respectful nod. "And you take care of him." They didn't linger. By sunset, the two had returned home. The porch creaked beneath John's boots as he slowly climbed the steps. The sky was painted with streaks of rose and copper, the kind of twilight that made everything feel sacred. He lowered himself into the old wooden chair with effort, placing the paper bag with the last cinnamon roll on the side table. Max sat beside him, body pressed against John's knee. They sat in silence for a long time. At the edge of the gravel road, the hum of an engine faded into silence. A white sedan parked by the mailbox. The door opened slowly. Rachel stepped out. She wore a dark coat over jeans, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. Her long brown hair was caught in a low ponytail, and her cheeks were flushed from the wind and the weight of returning. She carried nothing but her keys and the folded letter still tucked in her coat pocket. She stopped at the base of the porch steps. Looking up, John hadn't noticed her yet. From where she stood, she saw him sitting beside the dog, Max leaning gently against his leg, his frame smaller than she remembered. Her father looked tired. Smaller too, but there was a quiet light in his eyes, like he was savoring the last rays of a life well lived. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. She didn't move closer. She wasn't ready. Not yet. But she stayed. Dawn broke with no warmth. The sky over Asheville was a smothered gray, the kind that weighed on rooftops and bones alike. Frost laced the grass like fine glass filigree, and the trees stood naked and brittle, their branches clacking softly in the breeze. The air held that strange stillness, the kind that made even birds hold their breath. John Miller stepped outside into the bitter morning, wearing only his flannel shirt and house slippers. The cold bit into his skin, but he didn't notice. His chest had felt tight all night. Not pain, exactly, but pressure, like something heavy was sitting quietly between his lungs. He thought a walk to the garden might clear his head. Max followed close behind, trotting with a slow, steady gait, his tail swaying gently, breath already steaming in the air. John made it as far as the edge of the lawn before it hit. It was sudden, and it was final. His legs buckled as if his bones had turned to paper. He collapsed onto the frost-covered grass, a sharp breath stuck in his throat like a swallowed stone. The world tilted and twisted. His hand reached out, grasping for something, anything, but found only air. Max reacted instantly. The dog circled him, barking loud and fierce, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a flare in the night. He pawed at John's chest, then turned toward the road, took off sprinting down the gravel drive, and exploded into the street. Claire Donovan, a nurse in her late 30s, was driving her Subaru toward the hospital after an overnight shift. Claire had short red hair tucked into a messy braid and pale Irish skin that never seemed to get warm enough. Her eyes were a sharp, slate blue, the kind of eyes that had seen death and sorrow, and still chose to care anyway. She had a habit of driving the same route every morning, with a thermos of black coffee in her lap and jazz humming from her speakers. That morning, she slammed on the brakes when she saw the German Shepherd standing in the middle of the road, barking with wild urgency, then dashing back toward a house she didn't recognize. At first, she thought it was a stray. Then she saw the body. John lay motionless on the ground, his arms splayed wide, one slipper twisted off, steam rising faintly from his chest. Max stood over him, tail rigid, muzzle pressed against John's ribcage. Claire jumped from the car, grabbing her stethoscope from the front seat as she ran. She dropped to her knees beside him, felt for a pulse. Nothing. "No, no, no," she muttered, checking again. She tore open his shirt and started chest compressions, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Max didn't move. He remained pressed against John's side, his breathing steady, nose resting directly over John's heart, like he was willing it to beat again. Claire reached for her phone. Her fingers slipped on the screen. She was shaking, Finally, she hit the emergency call and gave the address, voice sharp with urgency. Suspected cardiac arrest. Elderly male, no pulse, CPR in progress. German Shepherd on scene, calm, not aggressive. I need backup now. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived. A pair of EMTs rushed out, Mark Hastings and Teresa Lopez. Mark was stocky, with a clean buzz cut and heavy stubble that made him look perpetually unshaven. Teresa, tall and athletic, had sharp cheekbones and the kind of calm that came from years of seeing people at their worst and helping them survive it. They moved as a unit, setting up defibrillators, oxygen lines, and a gurney. Claire stepped back, out of breath, covered in sweat despite the cold. "Flatline," Mark said, eyes on the monitor. "Charging to 200, Teresa responded. Max let out a single low growl, not threatening, but grieving. The shock hit. John's body jerked. The monitor stayed flat. "Again," Mark ordered. They shocked a second time. Max pressed harder into John's chest. Then, a flutter, a spike. Mark's voice caught. "We have rhythm." Claire's hands flew to her mouth. John's chest rose, not a gasp, a breath. Weak, strained, but real. The ride to the hospital was a blur of adrenaline and equipment. Max refused to be left behind, so Teresa let him sit in the back of the ambulance, one paw resting on John's arm the entire time. They wheeled him into the ER, where a code team was already prepped. Rachel arrived 10 minutes later. She had been driving from her motel on the south side of town when the call came through. Claire had recognized the name on the ID bracelet and asked the hospital staff to notify family. Rachel ran through the double doors in jeans and a parka, hair still damp from a rushed shower, eyes wide and raw. The nurse at the counter pointed her toward the ICU. When she stepped into the room, John was still intubated but stable. Machines beeped in soft rhythms. Tubes crisscrossed like wires through a battlefield. Max lay curled beneath the bed, eyes locked on Rachel like he knew who she was, like he had been waiting. She took one step, then another. John stirred. His eyelids fluttered. His hand twitched, and then he opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, rimmed with pain, but focused. He looked at her. "Rachel?" he croaked. She nodded, tears already pouring. He frowned, weakly. Why are you here?" She stepped closer, reached for his hand. "Because I never really left," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to come closer." He closed his eyes again, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. Spring in Asheville didn't arrive all at once. It tiptoed in slowly, like a child unsure of its welcome. The frost began to loosen its grip on the ground, leaving patches of soft mud and half-melted snow along the sidewalks. Crocuses peeked timidly through dead leaves, and the sky, once a permanent steel gray, began to show the hesitant blush of blue. The town stirred in response. Porch chairs reappeared, dogs barked at joggers again, and the bakery reopened its outdoor seating. At St. Joseph's Hospital, John Miller was wheeled out under that soft blue sky in a borrowed wheelchair pushed by a smiling nurse named Luis. Luis was a second-generation Cuban-American with caramel skin, close-cropped curls, and an infectious laugh. Only 25. He had the heart of someone twice his age and a habit of treating all his patients like war heroes. As he wheeled John toward the hospital exit, he kept up a steady stream of chatter about his mother's tamale recipe and how he was training for a marathon he didn't really want to run. John, bundled in a thick flannel jacket and a military-issue wool blanket, barely spoke. His face was gaunt but no longer gray, and the oxygen tube tucked beneath his nose moved with a steadier rhythm. His hands rested on his lap, one thumb gently rubbing the edge of a dog tag he now wore openly. Rachel waited by the curb in her sedan. She wore a lightweight navy coat and jeans, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder, revealing the sharp curve of her cheek and the soft tiredness beneath her eyes. She'd stayed every day since his collapse, slept on a chair beside his bed, ate cafeteria soup with him, and never once asked about the future. Luis opened the passenger door for her, then helped John into the seat. "He's still a tough one," Luis said with a grin. "Don't let him fool you." John gave a dry smile. "He's just happy I'm leaving." As they drove home, The silence between father and daughter was comfortable, not the jagged, fractured silence of years past, but the kind that lives quietly between people who are learning to speak again. When they reached the house, Max was already waiting. Rachel had brought him back from the emergency vet the day before. The dog moved slower now, noticeably. His back legs sometimes gave out on slick floors, and he no longer barked when visitors came. His eyes, though, still followed John like a shadow. The vet, Dr. Ellen Markham, was a slim woman in her early 50s with curly silver blonde hair and deep lines around her mouth that made her look constantly worried. She had explained Max's condition with scientific detachment at first, but her voice had faltered when she pulled up the scans. "His heart's failing, Mr. Miller," she had said. "It's like it gave everything it had, more than a dog should." John had nodded slowly. Yeah, he always did. Now, as John stepped onto the porch with Rachel's help, Max rose from where he lay near the door and walked to meet him. The dog leaned into his leg like always, and John dropped a hand onto his head. "No jumping today," he murmured. "We're both too old for that." Inside, the house had changed. Rachel had dusted everything, thrown out expired cans, even scrubbed the bathroom until it no longer smelled like bleach and regret. She'd set up a twin bed for John in the den, closer to the wood stove, and stacked books within arm's reach. She'd also hung a few framed photos, one of her mother in a garden hat, another of John in uniform, holding a younger Max at a military base. Their days became a rhythm. Breakfast was oatmeal and weak coffee. John would eat slowly, and Max would lie beside him, head resting on his slipper. Rachel would join after her walk, usually in sweatpants, her hair still damp from the shower. They spoke little at first, but slowly, like thawed streams finding their path, words began to return. John would say, "You remember that camping trip up in Pisgah? When it rained and the tent collapsed?" Rachel would laugh softly. "We slept in the car, and Max stole the last granola bar." At night, they listened to the radio, classical or jazz. Rachel would knit, something she'd picked up during her residency as a way to keep her fingers moving. John would stroke Max's fur absent-mindedly, sometimes humming tunelessly to the music. And occasionally, Rachel would read aloud, choosing dog-eared passages from her mother's favorite books. Max began to fade. He no longer climbed the stairs. His appetite shrank. Once, while watching the sunset from the porch, he leaned his full weight against John and didn't move for almost an hour. His breathing was slower now, each inhale long and deep, like it cost something. John never said the word goodbye. He just stayed close. He let Max sleep beside his bed again, like they were back in a field tent somewhere, guarding each other against whatever came next. He whispered stories into the dog's ear, about Ellie, about the desert, about the time Max chased a camel for half a mile because it made a strange sound. One evening, John looked up from his book to find Rachel watching him. "You talk to him like he understands every word," she said. John smiled. "He always has." They didn't say anything more. That night, Max didn't get up for his water bowl. His head rested on John's boot, his eyes half-lidded, but he watched until both of them fell asleep. Spring came to Asheville like a hymn played in slow and rising notes. The hills turned green one leaf at a time, and the air, once sharp with frost, now carried the scent of rain-damp soil and blooming tulips. The town shook off winter's stillness. Shops reopened their windows, children returned to the parks, and the birds, silent for months, returned with their old songs. At the edge of town, on the porch of a modest home with peeling green paint and a sagging roofline, John Miller sat in a wooden rocking chair, a quilt across his legs. The morning sun touched the porch with gentle fingers. Its warmth seeped into the floorboards and filled the air with that soft, early light that seems to blur the line between memory and presence. At John's feet lay Max. The dog no longer stood to greet the sun. His eyes were closed, his breath shallow and slow. His fur, once sleek and full, had dulled to a patchy gray-brown, thinning at the edges. His ribs rose gently beneath his skin, and his once strong limbs now trembled when he tried to move. John had known this morning would come. He didn't cry. His eyes were dry, steady, the way they had been in every battlefield, every memorial, every hospital room. But inside, something ached deeper than grief. It was love, distilled to its purest form, so deep it didn't need to be spoken. John slid from the rocking chair with effort, groaning softly as his knees protested. He lowered himself beside Max on the porch, one hand resting on the dog's shoulder. "You did good, soldier," he whispered. "More than I ever asked, more than I deserved." Max opened his eyes once more. They weren't glassy. They weren't afraid. They were tired, yes, but calm, like he knew this was the last post, and he was ready to be relieved. John leaned closer, resting his forehead against the dog's. "Rest now," he murmured. "You were the best damn soldier I ever knew." Max let out one long, slow breath. Oh, and then nothing. Not a twitch, not a gasp. Only stillness. John sat with him a long time, unmoving. The breeze shifted gently across the porch, lifting a corner of the quilt and brushing through Max's fur as if nature itself came to pay respects. Later that afternoon, Rachel returned from the co-op where she volunteered on Tuesdays. Her jeans were smudged with soil, and her hands smelled faintly of basil. When she stepped out of her car and saw her father sitting on the porch with Max's head in his lap, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't ask. She just walked to them, knelt quietly, and placed a hand on Max's flank. Then she leaned into her father's side and sat there, shoulder to shoulder, while the light faded. The burial happened the next morning. John insisted on doing it himself. Rachel helped, but he was the one who chose the spot, the old oak tree behind the house, where Max had once dug furiously for reasons only he understood. The roots curled out like open arms, and the ground beneath was soft from the spring rain. They wrapped Max in John's field blanket, the same one they'd shared during his last deployment. They laid him gently into the earth. A few days later, John placed a small, hand-carved stone at the base of the tree. He'd etched it himself with shaking hands, taking hours to get each letter right. It read, "He saved me more times than I can count. The last time, he gave me his heart." The years that followed were quieter, but not empty. John lived nearly 2 more years. The doctors called it a miracle, but he just smiled when they said it. He knew the truth. He'd been given time, not borrowed, but gifted, and he spent it the only way that made sense. With Rachel, they fell into a rhythm again. Rachel stayed. She tended the garden, repainted the house, learned to make biscuits from scratch the way her mother used to. In the evenings, she and John would sit on the porch, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories they'd kept locked away for too long. John wrote. At first, he scribbled memories in notebooks. Then, he typed them on an old laptop Rachel bought from the thrift store. He wrote about war, about Ellie, about losing and failing and trying again, but most of all, he wrote about Max, his essay. Final Watch. The Dog Who Gave Me Back My Life was published in a national veterans journal. It caught the attention of a few newspapers, then a radio show. Letters began arriving from other soldiers, other families, people who had known the silence of trauma and the comfort of an animal who stayed when others could not. Rachel took the spark and turned it into a flame. With John's encouragement, she opened a therapy center in town. Small at first, just 2 rooms and a fenced-in yard. It offered counseling, dog-assisted therapy, and weekend retreats for veterans with PTSD. She named it Max's Watch, a simple plaque hung near the entrance, carved from wood and framed in brass, for those who stood watch and those who watched over them. When John passed away quietly in his sleep nearly 2 years later, Rachel found him with a book on his chest and a photo of Max by his bed. He had made peace with the past, and he had left behind something that would carry forward, not in words alone, but in the wag of a tail, the warmth of a nuzzle, the steady breath of another life that had learned how to love without conditions. Sometimes, miracles don't come in flashes of light or thunder from the sky. Sometimes, they come on 4 legs, with a steady breath, a warm gaze, and a love so unwavering it rewrites the ending. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a soldier, a vessel of grace. And when the world gave up on John, Max didn't. He stood watch, not out of duty, but out of something far greater. Faith. Faith that love can heal what war has broken. faith that life, even when it's slipping away, can be pulled back by a heartbeat shared. In that quiet moment on the porch, when Max took his last breath beneath the spring sky, we were reminded God's miracles don't always come loudly, but they always come with love. So, if you've ever doubted second chances, if you've ever needed to believe that someone or something is watching over you, this story is for you. May God bless all the silent guardians out there, the dogs who love beyond logic, the veterans who carry invisible scars, the daughters who come home in time. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Tell us who your Max is. Share this with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us faith still walks among us. Sometimes, on four paws. He didn't come to the shelter to adopt. He came to remember. A 68-year-old veteran, heart heavy with grief, stood face to face with the saddest dog in the corner kennel. No bark, no wag, just eyes that had seen too much. But what happened next? No one could have predicted, because that broken dog, he didn't just find a home. He saved a life. If you're watching this, tell us, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop a comment, give a like if your heart's already melting, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that restore your faith in second chances. The wind rolled in from the west that morning, harsh and unfeeling, scraping the sidewalks of Chesterfield with the sharpness of a worn blade. It was early November, and the town, tucked between two forgotten interstates in northern Montana, wore its cold like an old uniform. Too proud to admit it, no longer fit. The sky hung low, thick with slate-colored clouds, and the breath of the town's few early risers turned to vapor in the air. Walter Pierce gripped the steering wheel with knuckles white from more than just the temperature. His old Chevy pickup rattled slightly as it cruised down the narrow road that bordered the pine woods to the south. He hadn't meant to drive this way. Not really. Walter, a 68-year-old veteran with the build of a man who never let himself go soft, wore the lines on his face like a map of wars fought both overseas and inside himself. His skin was leathery, darkened from decades under Afghan sun and American neglect, and his hands, scarred and veined, rested heavily on the wheel. His once dark beard had turned the color of ash, trimmed but stubborn around the chin. His gait had grown slower these days, but his eyes remained sharp, if tired, a steel blue that could still pierce through a lie in the right light. Since losing his wife, Marianne, 3 winters ago to pancreatic cancer, Walter's days had passed with a kind of hollow rhythm. Wake, coffee, walk, sit, remember. The living room still smelled faintly of her vanilla candles. The photo on the mantel, the one of him in Shadow, his military K-9 partner, hadn't moved in months. Shadow, a sable-coated German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes, had saved Walter's life in Kandahar by intercepting an insurgent before he could trigger an explosive vest. Shadow died that day. Walter never forgave himself for living. The truck slowed as the outline of a low, flat building came into view. Haven Ridge County Animal Shelter, a place he had passed dozens of times but never entered. Today, something shifted. He turned the wheel without thinking, crunching onto the gravel lot and pulling into a space by the fence. The building was squat, tired-looking, but clean. Wind tugged at the overhead sign, making it creak against its hinges. Walter killed the engine and stepped out, his boots landing with a solid thud. Inside, the air was warm but sterile, carrying a hint of bleach and damp fur. A bell chimed above the door. Behind the reception desk stood a young woman in a thick gray hoodie and worn jeans. Her name tag read Sarah. She looked to be in her early 20s, tall and lean, with copper-red hair pulled into a ponytail and freckles blooming across pale Irish skin. Her posture straightened as she saw him, but her eyes remained kind. "Good morning, sir," she said with practiced brightness. "Looking for someone special?" Walter hesitated, his voice rough like gravel after a long storm. "Not really, just passing through." Sarah gave a gentle nod, sensing the weight behind his words. "Feel free to take a look. Kennels are down the right hall." Walter nodded and walked slowly toward the corridor. The clicking of his boots echoed against the tile. He passed cage after cage, each with a hopeful face. Some barked, some wagged, some howled in pleading desperation. A small tan mutt did backflips. A senior bulldog snored in a blanket nest. Walter's gaze moved steadily, but never stopped, until it reached the final kennel on the left. There, half hidden in shadow, sat a dog that didn't rise, didn't greet, didn't beg. The tag said, Kaiser Intake, #723. The dog, a male German shepherd, roughly 6 years old, had a coat that once might have gleamed black and gold, now dulled with dirt and neglect. He was gaunt, ribs visible beneath thinning fur. One ear stood while the other flopped sideways. His eyes, deep brown, lifted slowly to meet Walter's, and for a moment, neither of them blinked. There was something behind those eyes, not just fear, but memory, pain, endurance, recognition. Sarah reappeared beside him. "That's Kaiser," she said softly. "Came in 2 months ago. Someone found him behind a gas station off Route 47. No chip, no collar. He wouldn't let anyone near him for days." Walter crouched, joints groaning in protest. "Anyone tried adopting him?" "A couple people," Sarah said. "But he shuts down when strangers come. Doesn't bark, doesn't move. Most think something's wrong with him." Walter didn't speak. He simply reached through the bars, palm facing up. Kaiser didn't flinch. He didn't move either, but his nose twitched. The silence between them stretched until Sarah asked gently, "Would you like to meet him outside the kennel?" Walter stood, brushing off his knees. "Yeah," he said. "I think I would." They led Kaiser to the visitation pen out back. The dog walked slowly, the leash slack in Sarah's hand. He didn't resist, but he didn't lead either. Once inside the open space, Sarah unclipped the lead and stepped back. Kaiser stood still. Walter sat down on the bench, his breath fogging in the cold air. Minutes passed. Then Kaiser moved, one slow step, then another, until he stood 3 feet away. He didn't sit. He just looked. Walter pulled the photo from his coat pocket, the one he always carried, shadow beside him in uniform. He held it out. Not for Kaiser, but for himself. "He saved me once," he said to no one. "I was supposed to bring him home, but he never made it. I don't know if I ever did, either." Kaiser moved closer. Slowly, carefully, he sat down at Walter's feet, his head lowered, not in submission, but solidarity. Walter looked down. "Guess you've been through a war of your own." His hand hovered, then gently rested on the dog's neck. No flinch, just warmth. Sarah, watching from the doorway, smiled to herself. When she returned with the paperwork, she said, "We've never seen him take to anyone like that." Walter shrugged. Maybe he just needed another ghost to talk to. The process took 20 minutes. Sarah handed over a simple leash, a bag of kibble, and a folder of medical notes. "He's underweight," she said, "but otherwise stable. Vet says he just needs time." Walter opened the truck's back door and laid down the fleece blanket he kept in winter. Kaiser hesitated, then jumped up, circling twice before curling into a tight ball. The door shut gently behind him. They drove off into the wind, leaving behind a shelter that no longer held Kaiser's story. Walter didn't speak during the drive. He just watched the mirror and saw, for the first time in years, a glimmer of life in the seat behind him. The sky over Chesterfield cracked with ice-blue light as the sun finally climbed its way through the slats of dark clouds. The second morning after Kaiser came home was colder than the first, and the wind sliced sharper. Snow had not yet come, but the earth felt like it was holding its breath. Walter stood by the kitchen window, mug in hand, watching as the frost curled like spider legs across the glass. His house, a one-story structure with peeling gray paint and a stoop that groaned underfoot, sat nestled between 2 bare oaks at the end of Maple Drive. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind where nobody waved unless it was summer or Sunday. The lawn was unkempt but honest, patches of yellow grass, stubborn weeds still hanging on, and a broken garden gnome half buried near the porch. Inside, the house was simple but solid, pine wood floorboards that creaked like old joints, beige walls with sun-faded photos, and a fireplace that hadn't held fire since the day Marianne passed. A pair of combat boots sat beside the door, polished out of habit, not necessity. Walter Pierce moved like a man made of stone, but inside, something had started to shift. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, his brown leather belt worn to a shine near the buckle. His back was still straight, but every step carried the quiet ache of memory. At 68, he still shaved every other morning with a straight razor, but the stubble grew faster these days. His face was lined with sun and grief, and his eyes, those unwavering steel blue eyes, held both discipline and fatigue. He had the hands of a builder, rough and thick, with a single pink scar stretching from wrist to palm where shrapnel once kissed bone. Kaiser lay by the front door, unmoving, eyes half closed but alert. The dog hadn't yet ventured far into the house, hadn't sniffed the sofa or the fireplace or the old wool rug that still held Marianne's perfume. The German Shepherd was 5 or 6 years old by the shelter's guess, but his eyes spoke of older winters. He was lean, too lean, his ribs still pushing against his dull fur. His tail rarely moved, and his ears, one sharp, one slouched, tilted ever so slightly at the sound of every creak. He didn't beg, didn't whine, he simply watched. Walter respected that. The silence in the house wasn't unfamiliar. Walter had grown used to its weight since losing Marianne. But now, that silence had presence. It wasn't emptiness, it was Kaiser, and something about that changed everything. Walter read the newspaper out loud as he sat at the table with his toast and black coffee. It was a habit he hadn't shaken since retirement. "Well, would you look at that?" he said gruffly, eyes scanning the headline. "Gas up again. Surprised? Me neither." Kaiser didn't react. "You know, Shadow used to growl when I said taxes." He chuckled quietly to himself. Smart bastard. That afternoon, Walter moved to the porch. He sat in his favorite rocker, a deep brown chair that groaned like an old friend every time he leaned back. The wind was biting, but Walter didn't mind. He pulled his green military jacket tighter and sipped his second cup of coffee. Kaiser sat in the doorway behind him, head resting on his front paws, eyes focused on the birds picking at dead leaves. He hadn't moved since breakfast. Not out of fear, it was something else, a kind of cautious observation, like a soldier on his first patrol. By the third day, Kaiser started to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but there were signs. When Walter walked into the backyard to check on the hydrangeas, the ones Marianne had planted and he'd forgotten how to care for, he heard the soft pad of paws behind him. Kaiser didn't get close, just followed. 5 feet back, ears twitching with each breeze. When Walter sat on the porch steps to clip dead stems, Kaiser lay down at a distance, head low but facing him. That night, Walter left his bedroom door ajar. He didn't expect anything, but just past midnight, a soft thump echoed in the hallway. Walter lay still, listening. The click of claws, the breath of paws, shifting weight, then silence. The next morning, the hallway rug had a single dip near the door, like someone had been lying there all night. On the 5th day, Walter made scrambled eggs and added a little cooked chicken to Kaiser's bowl. The dog approached slowly, sniffed, then ate without urgency. Every bite was careful, measured. When Walter sat down with his own plate, he spoke aloud. "When I lost Shadow, they told me to get another dog right away, like you can swap out souls like spare parts." Kaiser lifted his head, ears tilting. "Took me 15 years to even walk into a shelter, and there you were." Kaiser didn't blink. He simply watched. By day 6, Kaiser followed Walter from room to room, not close enough to touch, but always present. When Walter fixed a squeaky cabinet hinge in the kitchen, Kaiser lay in the doorway. When he opened the shed to grab a shovel, Kaiser sat by the garden path, tail thumping once. Walter found himself talking more, not rambling, just sharing. Marianne hated this paint color, said it made the kitchen look like a hospital. Kaiser tilted his head. She'd probably have picked something ridiculous. Sunflower yellow. Can you imagine? That evening, as the sky turned burnt orange and dusk settled in like dust, Walter sat in the rocker again. He pulled an old cigar from the drawer beside him. Unlit. Just something to hold. Kaiser walked to the porch, slower this time, and sat beside the steps. "You've been quiet," Walter said. "That a good sign?" Kaiser looked up at him, eyes calm but unreadable. Walter leaned back, the rocker creaking. "You don't have to fill the silence. You just have to sit in it. That's all I ever needed." As night fell, and the stars blinked through the bare branches above. Walter spoke one more time. "You can stay as long as you want." "Soldier?" Kaiser didn't move, but for the first time, his tail gave a slow, quiet wag. The storm rolled in like a slow war. No fanfare, no warning shot. Just a shifting pressure in the air and a stillness that crept over Chesterfield like a held breath. The sun had not been seen all day, cloaked behind thick banks of bruised gray clouds. By dusk, the wind began to whisper, then howl, tugging at window panes and fence posts like restless ghosts. Walter Pierce, sitting in his worn rocker on the porch, watched the trees sway with the same focus he once used on foreign soil. Calculated, quiet, waiting for the first strike. His flannel jacket hung open, revealing a dark green sweatshirt that bore the faded insignia of the 101st Airborne. His breath came slower now these days, not because he lacked strength, but because the days were no longer things to rush through. They were things to survive. Inside, the house had grown colder, shadows curling in corners, the kind that made a man reach for a blanket and memory in equal measure. The kitchen light flickered once, then steadied. Walter rubbed his chest with one hand, absently noting the tightness had returned. It was a dull thing, like a fist in his ribs. Not new, but not entirely familiar either. He dismissed it the way men like him dismiss most pain, with silence and a stubborn sip of water. Kaiser paced near the fireplace, unsettled. His movements had grown more fluid over the past week, less cautious, more certain. But tonight the storm had knocked something loose. Thunder cracked across the sky like an old gunshot, and the shepherd flinched, ears folding back, tail low. At 6 years old, Kaiser was a storm-weathered soul, but some echoes still reached deep. He circled once, then again, nails clicking sharply against the wood floor. Walter rose slowly from the porch chair and stepped inside, boots heavy, breath catching slightly. "You're not a fan of thunder," he muttered, half chuckling. "Can't blame you." The wind slammed against the side of the house, and the front door trembled in its frame. Kaiser jumped back, body tensing. Walter reached for the latch, but paused halfway, a sudden wave of heat flooding his chest. It felt like a punch from the inside. His vision blurred for a second, and he leaned against the kitchen counter, one hand gripping the edge. He blinked hard, willing it away. "Not now," he whispered, not to the storm, but to his body. Not tonight. But his legs betrayed him. He stumbled forward, knocking a ceramic mug to the floor. It shattered. Echoing louder than thunder, Kaiser froze. Then Walter collapsed. Not all at once, first to his knees, then sideways, slumping beside the back door like a man who had simply grown too tired. The room spun. His breath came short, shallow, like trying to drink through a cracked straw. One hand reached weakly toward the cupboard, then dropped. Kaiser stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds. Then something ancient, something trained or remembered, kicked in. He moved forward, nudging Walter's shoulder with his nose. No response. He whined, a soft, urgent sound that broke the silence like glass. Then he turned and ran toward the hallway. His body moved with purpose now, instinct overriding fear. At the far end of the hall, just beside the bedroom door, a red square sat mounted on the wall, an emergency call button installed years ago. Back when Marianne was sick, Walter had forgotten it was even there. Kaiser hadn't. The shepherd jumped once, paws hitting the baseboard. The button was too high. He tried again, this time standing on his hind legs, claws scraping the paneling. A sharp bark escaped him, a sound the house had never heard before. It wasn't panic. It was command. One more leap, this time catching the button with the edge of his paw. A soft click followed. A light blinked red. 20 miles away, a dispatcher named Eliza Marsh received the emergency signal. Eliza, 42, short and broad-shouldered, with tightly curled black hair pinned back under a headset, had worked the night shift for 6 years. She was known for her calm tone, even during house fires or highway accidents. But when she saw the Pierce residence code pop up, marked as Veteran Emergency Assist, her fingers moved faster. She sent the paramedics within 40 seconds. Back at the house, Kaiser had returned to Walter's side. He lay next to the man's still form, nose pressed to his shoulder. Breathing matched to breathing. It had slowed, too slow. Kaiser let out a single bark every few minutes, as if to say, "We're not done yet." The paramedics arrived 16 minutes after the signal. The team of 2 men moved quickly, one tall and wiry with sandy hair and tattoos down one arm, the other shorter, thick-built, with a face full of stubble and eyes like coffee grounds. The tall one, Micah, checked Walter's pulse, while the short one, Dan, set up the oxygen mask. "Mild myocardial infarction," Micah muttered. Lucky he wasn't out here alone. Dan looked at the dog sitting stiffly nearby, eyes focused but unmoving. Was he alone? Micah glanced at the emergency button, then back at the dog. Apparently not. Kaiser followed the gurney as they rolled Walter out, staying just out of reach but never out of sight. When the ambulance doors shut, Kaiser whined once, then sat on the porch, head low, ears flat, waiting. 3 hours later, at Chesterfield General Hospital, Walter opened his eyes to the scent of antiseptic and the faint beep of a monitor. His chest ached. He blinked twice, struggling to piece together what had happened. Then he heard a familiar shuffle, the sound of claws on linoleum. Kaiser was there, sitting in the corner of the room, beside a nurse named Lori. Lori, a woman in her mid-30s with olive skin and a tired ponytail, stood with a clipboard in hand and a warm smile. "He wouldn't let anyone keep him outside," she said. "Waited at the ER doors like he belonged here." Walter tried to speak, but only managed a nod. Lori leaned closer. "Doctor says if help had come 10 minutes later, we'd be telling a different story." Walter turned his head slowly toward Kaiser, who rose and stepped forward. The dog placed one paw gently on the edge of the hospital bed and held Walter's gaze. There was no wag, no bark, just that steady, loyal stare. Walter managed to whisper, "Good boy." The snow came 2 days after Walter was released from the hospital. Not the heavy, suffocating kind that smothers a town in silence, but a thin, steady fall that coated Chesterfield in soft layers of white. The pine trees sagged beneath its weight like tired shoulders. Sidewalks shimmered with frost, and the lake just south of town began to gather a thin crust of ice along its edges. Winter had arrived with grace. Not violence, and it fit the town like an old coat, patched, familiar, and always a little too cold. Walter Pierce stood at the window of his modest home, bundled in a thick navy cardigan and a pair of gray sweatpants he wouldn't have been caught dead wearing 20 years ago. His left hand still bore a hospital wristband. His right held a pen. The notebook was old, leather-bound, dark brown, pages yellowed at the edges. Marianne had gifted it to him on their last Christmas together, the spine stamped with a single word in gold, observations. Walter had never used it, not until now. On the first page, in small capital letters, he wrote, "Kaiser Day 1 post-storm." Then beneath it, "He saved me." Kaiser lay at his feet, head resting atop the man's slipper, eyes half-lidded but alert. The German shepherd had changed in small, hard-to-define ways since that night. His gaze held more weight now, more understanding. He still flinched at loud noises, still circled twice before lying down, but there was a certainty in his presence, a claim to space that hadn't been there before. He was no longer just in the house, he was part of it. Walter scratched at his beard, now streaked in silver and steel, and looked down at the dog. "You knew? Somehow? You just knew?" He opened the notebook again. Note, watches me more closely now, tracks every movement, doesn't follow, guards. Later that morning, they walked. The snow crunched underfoot as Walter moved slowly, still adjusting to the tightness in his chest. Kaiser walked beside him, head low, paws silent on the ice. They followed a path that curved behind the houses of Maple Drive, toward the lake trail where Shadow used to run. Walter paused by the old wooden bench and tapped the seat. "Sit." His voice was calm, firm. Kaiser hesitated, then stepped forward and sat squarely beside it. Walter blinked. He tried again. "Down." Kaiser dropped to his belly, paws extended, tail still. Walter didn't smile. He swallowed hard and stared at the dog. Again, down. Kaiser repeated the command without hesitation, not out of obedience, but recognition. When they returned, Walter pulled a small box from the hallway closet. Inside were remnants from a past life, a worn collar with Shadow's name tag, a folded American flag, and a laminated training sheet from Fort Carson's K-9 division. He laid it all on the table and stared at it for a long while. Then he picked up the training sheet and walked into the living room. Kaiser followed. That afternoon, Walter began reintroducing old commands, not in drills, but in games. Heal, stay, search. Some Kaiser ignored. Others he executed perfectly. When Walter tossed a red ball into the hallway and whispered, "Track it," Kaiser lowered his head, sniffed once, then trotted after it with precision. Not like a pet chasing a toy, but like a partner following a scent. Walter watched him return, tail wagging slightly, ball held gently between teeth. "Well, hell," he muttered, writing again in the notebook. He remembers what no one taught him. Over the next few days, their routine solidified. Breakfast was followed by 10 minutes of commands. Walks became opportunities for training. Walter placed treats behind tree stumps or under overturned flower pots. Kaiser found them every time. One afternoon, Walter knelt beside the old garden shed and whispered, "Guard." Kaiser planted himself at the door, muscles taut, ears forward, unmoving until released. Walter sat on the porch steps, his breath visible in the cold air, and whispered, "You're not just a dog, you're someone's soldier." The neighborhood began to notice. Mr. Halvers, a retired librarian with a permanent stoop and snow-colored eyebrows, paused during his daily shuffle down the sidewalk. "That your new pup?" he asked, squinting through wire-rimmed glasses. "That's Kaiser," Walter said. "Smart one." Halvers nodded. "Got a good face. Looks like he knows things." Walter chuckled. "He does." One morning, Walter walked into the kitchen carrying 2 bowls. He placed one on the floor and one on the table. Scrambled eggs and toast for himself. Cooked chicken and rice for Kaiser. As he sat down, he noticed the dog already sitting, waiting, gaze fixed but patient. Walter narrowed his eyes. Shadow used to do the same. Kaiser's ears perked. Walter nodded slowly, writing again. Pattern is identical. Position, posture, eye contact. It's like a ghost lives inside him. Later that week, Walter visited the local feed store for new dog food and a better collar. The clerk was a man named Carson Miller, mid-50s, with a stocky build, permanent grease under his nails, and a low, gravelly voice that made everything sound like a secret. He wore a heavy denim vest over a red flannel, and one sleeve was stitched at the elbow, where his Doberman had chewed it as a pup. Carson had served in the Army, too. Walter knew him from the veterans' breakfasts downtown. "You training that dog yourself?" Carson asked, as he rang up the bag of kibble. "Yeah," Walter said. "Just the basics. Or maybe not so basic." Carson raised an eyebrow. "That dog's got soldier eyes." Walter didn't reply. He just nodded once and left the store. That night, Walter sat at the dining table under the yellow glow of a single lamp. The notebook lay open beside a cooling cup of tea. Kaiser rested on the rug by the window, his ears twitching slightly in his sleep. Walter wrote slowly, carefully, every letter a small act of witness. It's not about obedience. It's about remembering who we were. Together. He paused, stared at the ink drying on the page, then added one more line. "Shadow saved my life once. Now Kaiser is helping me live again." Spring in Chesterfield didn't arrive with blossoms or bird songs. It crept in quietly, like a soldier returning home, mud on its boots, frost still clinging to its shoulders. The snow didn't melt all at once, but retreated in uneven patches across the lawns, exposing damp earth and forgotten leaves. The sun, hesitant and pale, peeked through a sky that was still more gray than blue. It was the kind of season that smelled like wet pine and sounded like dripping gutters. Walter Pierce stood at the edge of his front porch, one hand gripping the railing, the other holding Kaiser's leash loosely. He wore a faded tan coat, patched at the elbows, over a flannel shirt tucked into jeans that had long since lost their original color. His boots were caked in slush. His beard had grown a little longer, now speckled with white like the grass. Kaiser sat beside him, upright, ears high, tail motionless. The German shepherd had filled out since winter. His coat, once dull and uneven, now glinted faintly in the morning light. He had the alert stillness of a soldier on post, calm, but never inattentive. Children walking to the school bus would wave at him now. Some called his name. Kaiser never barked at them. He simply watched, sometimes gave a slow blink, sometimes a single tail wag. Walter's neighbor, Mrs. Edna Collins, was the kind of woman who had aged in a spiral, sharp at the core, but softened at the edges. She was 84 years old, wore pink cardigans no matter the season, and still curled her hair every Thursday. She walked every morning with a cane that had a rubber tip worn nearly smooth. Walter noticed her just as she stepped onto the sloped sidewalk in front of her yard. It had rained the night before, and the pavement was slick. Kaiser noticed her too, his head tilted slightly, ears twitching. Walter turned his head to greet her. "Morning, Edna." She raised her hand, voice cheery but hoarse. "You and your handsome bodyguard out again, I see." Walter gave a half smile. "We make a good pair." Then it happened. As Edna stepped over a slick patch near her driveway, her foot slid, the cane slipped out from under her, and she crumpled to the pavement with a sharp cry. Walter's body tensed. "Damn it!" But Kaiser was already moving. The leash slipped from Walter's hand as the shepherd darted forward, paws silent, head low. He reached Edna's side in seconds, circled once, and lay down beside her, not touching, but close enough that his body formed a barrier between her and the edge of the curb. Walter rushed behind him. Edna was breathing hard, one hand clutching her hip. I think I just twisted something." Walter knelt slowly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let me help you sit up." Edna chuckled breathlessly, voice shaking. "Your dog beat you to it." Walter looked at Kaiser, who hadn't moved. The shepherd's eyes were fixed on Edna's face, calm but alert, like he understood exactly what had happened and what hadn't. Walter called for help, and within minutes, a younger neighbor named Luis came jogging over. Luis was in his late 20s, dark-skinned, lean, with short dreads pulled back under a wool cap. He worked at the grocery store and lived with his grandmother across the street. "You okay, Mrs. Collins?" he asked, crouching beside her. "With a bodyguard like this?" She gestured toward Kaiser, who finally stood and stepped aside as they helped her to her feet. "I'll live." The story spread down Maple Drive faster than the melting snow. By the next morning, 3 kids stopped by to ask if they could pet the dog that saved Miss Edna. Kaiser sat on the porch like a statue, letting them stroke his fur and whisper their thanks. One girl, maybe 9 years old with a mess of freckles and a purple scarf, looked up at Walter and asked, "Is he magic?" Walter bent slightly to meet her eyes. "No, but he listens better than most people." That Sunday, Walter received a call from Paul Beckman, a stocky man with a thick white mustache and the energy of a retired drill sergeant who couldn't quite let go. Paul ran the Chesterfield Veterans Committee and had a voice like gravel dragged across pavement. He'd known Walter for decades, though they rarely spoke outside of town events. "We're doing a community day next month," Paul said. "Cookout, speakers, honor guard. Thought maybe you'd stop by, say a few words." Walter cleared his throat. "Not much of a speaker." "You don't have to be. Just show up. Bring the dog. People have been talking." Walter looked at Kaiser, who was curled beside the heater, one paw twitching in a dream. "All right. We'll come." The day of the event arrived with unseasonably warm weather. The sky was clear, pale blue, the kind that made flags flutter against it like bright scars. The community park was dotted with folding chairs and picnic tables. A few tents had been set up, one serving coffee, another selling local crafts. Children darted between booths. Adults gathered in clumps near the grill station. Walter hadn't been in a crowd this large in years. His hand gripped Kaiser's leash a little tighter. They were met at the park entrance by a woman named Jeanette Rowe, a tall, statuesque woman in her 50s with long silver hair and an elegance that came not from fashion but from posture. She was the town's community director and had organized the event. Her handshake was warm but firm. "Walter," she said with a bright smile, "so glad you came. And this must be the famous Kaiser." Kaiser sniffed her hand gently, then sat at Walter's side, tail sweeping once across the grass. Jeanette's eyes softened. "He's exactly as everyone described." The speeches were short, Paul said a few words about service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Then, unannounced, he called Walter to the mic. Walter hesitated, then stood. He walked slowly to the small podium. Kaiser followed. Walter looked out over the crowd, neighbors, children, familiar and unfamiliar faces. His voice was quiet but steady. I served a long time ago. I lost a good friend overseas. 4 legs, a tail, a heart bigger than most men I've known. He paused. For years. I didn't think I'd ever have that kind of connection again. Then one day, this dog showed up at the end of a hallway in a shelter. He didn't bark. He didn't wag. He just waited. He looked down at Kaiser. Now he walks with me every morning. He watches this neighborhood like he was born to protect it. He saved my life once, and someone else's too. A pause. We don't always choose the battles we fight, but sometimes, if we're lucky, we choose how we come back. When he finished, the applause was soft but long. Children ran up afterward to take pictures. Older veterans patted his shoulder. Paul gave him a nod, the kind of nod soldiers gave each other when words failed. And Kaiser stood beside him through it all, calm, composed, proud, not barking, not begging, just being. The Colorado sky had fallen into a heavy hush, snow drifting slow and constant like time itself had softened. Walter Pierce's modest, one-story home, nestled near the outer curve of Ashwood Lane, looked swallowed by the night, its roof blanketed in a fresh sheet of white. The pine trees around the property stood sentinel, shoulders thick with snow. The cold was dry, biting, the kind that crept into the joints and settled behind the ribs like an unwelcome visitor. Walter, 68, sat in his worn brown recliner, wrapped in a thick green wool blanket his late wife had knitted during her last winter. His breathing was slower these days, his pulse more fragile, as if time had learned to whisper instead of march. His skin, once bronzed and battle-worn, now clung loosely to his angular frame, pallid under the flickering light of the old reading lamp. His white beard had grown more uneven, trimmed only occasionally with dull scissors, and the faded scar over his left brow twitched every so often when he fell into deeper thought. Kaiser lay by the fireplace, head resting between his front paws. The German shepherd was now around 6 years old, but years of neglect before meeting Walter had aged him beyond that. His coat had regained a soft, healthy sheen, dark sable with streaks of black down his spine and tail. His ears perked slightly at every creak of the house or a shift of wind outside, but his eyes never left Walter for long. There was a bond there, forged not by training but by understanding. A soldier and a sentinel, stitched together by silence and second chances. Walter had felt it in his bones for weeks now, a tug behind the ribs, the slowing of breath that no medication could delay forever. He had always known that age and the damage he carried from his years in Afghanistan would one day ask for reckoning. That night, the ache in his chest felt different. Not sharp, not urgent, just final, like a slow dimming of lights. He shuffled across the living room and sat down at the oak writing desk, tucked beneath the front window. The snowfall danced beyond the glass, and the wind hummed low, steady. He reached into the top drawer and pulled out a yellowing envelope labeled Emily. Inside was a short letter, one he'd rewritten half a dozen times. Emily Pierce was Walter's only daughter, 38 now, living in Oregon with her husband and 2 boys. She was tall like her mother, with deep brown eyes and the same sharp jawline Walter saw in the mirror. They hadn't spoken in over 2 years, not out of anger, but out of time slipping by. Walter had always found words difficult, especially since the war, but tonight, he found them. My dearest Em, I don't know how much longer I have, but I wanted to tell you something important. After your mom passed, I was hollow. Kaiser filled something in me I thought was long gone. He's not just a dog. He's the reason I'm still here, the reason I laughed again. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't visit. But know this, my final days were not alone. They were shared with a friend who reminded me that love never truly dies. In the cabinet beside the fireplace, you'll find a small box. It's yours. I love you. Always. Dad. He folded the letter carefully, sealed it in the envelope, and set it beside the picture of Shadow, the original war dog, the the one who had saved his life in Kandahar by tackling him out of the way of a grenade. Shadow had taken the blast instead. That photo, worn at the edges, showed a younger Walter with darker hair, smiling as Shadow sat obediently beside him, a ribboned medal dangling from the dog's collar. In the cabinet he had mentioned, Walter had already placed 3 items: his bronze star, Shadow's old leather collar, cracked but lovingly preserved, and a new black collar with a silver nameplate. It read, "Kaiser, the soul of 2 lives." The fire had died to soft embers when Walter leaned back into his recliner again, his vision blurred at the edges. His heartbeat echoed like distant drums in a canyon. Kaiser lifted his head, sensing the change. He stood slowly, ears flattening. The room was quiet, but weighted. Walter's breath grew shallower, and his hand twitched against the armrest. Then, in the hush of pre-dawn, Kaiser did something he hadn't done in weeks. He climbed onto the footrest, stepped gently across Walter's lap, and licked his face. Once, firmly, just beneath the eye. It wasn't panic. It wasn't pleading. It was presence. It was a call to the living. Walter's eyes fluttered. He felt the warmth of the tongue, the soft pressure of paws pressing into his thighs. He stirred, breath catching. "Still here? Are you?" he murmured, the words crumbling from his lips like dry leaves. Kaiser wagged his tail gently. Walter sat up slightly, blinking. The darkness had been deep, but Kaiser had pulled him from it. The sun began to stretch across the snow outside, and the first light found the 2 of them, old soldier and loyal dog, sitting in silence, wrapped in another borrowed morning. Spring in Boulder came slowly, like an apology whispered through the thawing pines. The snow had melted into thirsty soil, and tiny wildflowers peeked cautiously through patches of grass along the edges of Flagstaff Mountain. The air carried a chill in the morning, but by afternoon, the warmth clung gently to bare arms, coaxing life from the earth. Trees once skeletal now shimmered green, and the city hummed softly with people returning to the parks, the trails, and the porches of quiet neighborhoods. Walter Pierce, now 69, walked carefully along the gravel path that circled Twin Lakes Park. His back was slightly hunched, but his steps were steadier than they had been in months. Beside him trotted Kaiser, his German shepherd, now 7, tail swaying in calm arcs, ears alert but relaxed. Kaiser wore the black collar Walter had prepared months ago, the one that bore the silver engraving, "The soul of 2 lives." Trailing just behind them was a woman in her late 30s with copper-brown hair tied in a low ponytail. Emily Pierce had her father's eyes, storm gray with flecks of gold, and the way she watched him was soft and deliberate, like she was memorizing every detail. She wore a cream cardigan over a faded blue dress and sneakers speckled with park dust. Her fingers occasionally brushed the shoulder of the little girl walking beside her. The child, Lucy, was 6 years old and full of questions. She had a mop of auburn curls that bounced every time she skipped, and cheeks the color of ripe peaches. She held a bright red leash clipped to Kaiser's collar. Though Kaiser didn't need it, he walked as if tethered not by rope, but by love. "Grandpa," Lucy asked, "was Kaiser really a war dog like in the stories?" Walter chuckled, a deep, hearty sound that surprised even himself. "No, sweetheart, but he carries the soul of one." It was the first time in years Walter had laughed without apology. Not the tight-lipped chuckle he offered to neighbors out of politeness, but a genuine, open laugh. Emily's eyes shimmered. The trio reached a bench overlooking the lake. Ducks scattered lazily across the surface, and the late afternoon sun dipped lower, coating the water in amber. Walter sat down slowly, exhaling as he settled. Kaiser lay by his boots, eyes half closed but ears still tracking every child's giggle, every cyclist's bell. Later that week, a letter came from the Boulder Veterans Affairs Office. Inside was a formal invitation. Walter and Kaiser had been nominated to receive an honorary citation at the annual Heroes Among Us ceremony. It was a tribute not only to Walter's military service, but to Kaiser's act of saving his life that stormy night, as documented by the paramedics and the home alert system. On the day of the event, spring rain had left the city washed and clean. The sky above the Boulder Civic Center was clear, with soft wisps of cloud drifting like old memories. Flags waved at half-mast for a recently fallen soldier, and the air was filled with solemn pride. The amphitheater was set with folding chairs and a modest stage. Families, veterans, children, and rescue workers filled the rows. Emily stood with Lucy near the front, her hands wrapped around her daughter's shoulders. Walter, dressed in a dark blazer and polished shoes, waited at the edge of the stage. He looked more put together than usual, clean-shaven, hair combed back, the bronze star pinned to his left chest. Kaiser sat by his side, calm and dignified. The press had already dubbed him the Silent Guardian. Cameras flashed as the host, a young army major with buzzed hair and a gentle southern drawl, read out Walter's story. And the moment Kaiser had pressed the emergency button that saved his life. When Walter was called up, the applause was immediate and generous. He walked to the microphone slowly, taking a moment to rest one hand on Kaiser's head before turning to the audience. He cleared his throat. His voice, though aged, was steady. "I once thought I was the one who saved this dog," he said. "Took him out of a cage, gave him food, gave him safety, but I was wrong." He paused, scanning the crowd, and then looked down at Kaiser. "Because what I learned is that he's the one who brought me home." For a moment, the wind stilled, then the applause rose again. Not polite this time, but heartfelt. A standing ovation followed, many clapping with eyes brimming. Lucy clapped the hardest of all, shouting, "That's my grandpa!" Later that evening, Walter declined the after-party invitations and asked Emily to drive him and Kaiser to the lake one last time before sunset. The three of them sat on the old wooden dock, legs swinging gently above the water. Lucy fed bits of cracker to the ducks, while Emily leaned her head on her father's shoulder. Kaiser lay between them, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun, like a candle extinguished in slow motion, dipped below the hills, leaving only ribbons of orange and violet in its place. Walter exhaled slowly. "You know," he said softly, "Shadow would have liked this place." Emily smiled. "You think dogs remember each other?" Walter looked down at Kaiser, who raised his head and met his gaze. "Maybe they remember for us." That night, as the stars began to salt the sky, Walter and Kaiser stayed behind for a while longer, two silhouettes against the lake, quiet and whole. Oh, the soldier and the dog, the broken man and the rescuer, together. They had crossed the bridge from memory to meaning. Two lives, one soul, carried forward not by war or loss, but by healing. Final message, a whisper from heaven. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, they come on four legs, with quiet eyes and a loyal heart. Kaiser didn't just save Walter's life. He reminded us all that healing doesn't always begin in hospitals or therapy rooms. Sometimes, it begins with presence, with love, with the grace of a creature placed in our path at just the right moment. And maybe, just maybe, that's how God works. Not always in grand gestures, but in the soft moments we nearly miss. A wagging tail, a second chance, a reason to get out of bed again. So, if you're watching this and feel like you're alone, remember, heaven sends its helpers in many forms. Comment below if you've ever been touched by an animal's love. Say a prayer tonight for all the forgotten dogs still waiting in silence. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that they still matter. Subscribe if you believe in second chances and in the quiet power of unconditional love. May God bless you and all who walk beside you, whether they walk on two legs or four.